Thank you all for joining us. I know it's been a couple of weeks. We kept hoping that we would have the final OSHA updates, but they've been a little slower than we expected. So we wanted to go ahead and reach back out to you all and give you some more info in the meantime. Our normal host, Lyle Hanna, is currently in the air at the moment. He wanted to join desperately, but he is not going to be able to. So I'll be hosting today. And we've got Tyler Morris here to give us the scoop on all of the legal updates. So we're excited to have him. So as always, put your questions in the chat and we'll get started. So your normal team is with you today. And what we're going to do is cover two topics: where have all the workers gone, and COVID updates and legal and regulatory changes. So I'm going to run us through really quick. As we all know, we're going through kind of the Great Resignation at this moment. We've had a lot of different webinars on different ways to recruit, different things to kind of keep in mind as you are losing your workforce. And so what I wanted to do is just kind of summarize some of the articles that we've seen coming out about where are all these workers? Why are people not wanting to be in the workforce at the moment? And according to a lot of the different articles that we've read, 4.3 million workers are considered missing. So that's a pretty big chunk of the population. It's actually the biggest drop in workforce participation since at least World War II in the early months of the pandemic. While those numbers slightly rebounded last summer, they are now hovering around the lowest level since the 1970s. So this really is a large and widespread issue. U.S. employers are struggling to fill over 10 million job openings. And while a lot of economists expected the labor shortage, expect the labor shortage to persist for years, they were hoping that daycare reopening, schools reopening, the slowdown of Delta, all of those things would make a positive impact. So far, that has not happened. The lack of people in the workforce is especially affecting women, workers without a college degree, and service industries. So hotels, restaurants, childcare providers. In fact, hotels are employing 17% less people in August of this year than pre-pandemic. And childcare, the industry as a whole, is employing over 10% less people in September 21 than pre-pandemic. So you're going to see those things are helping contribute to some of the workforce and labor issues that we're seeing. So causes in the decrease in people in the labor market include things like pandemic-driven acceleration of retirement. A lot of people who weren't planning to retire went ahead and did so early or were offered buyouts in lieu of layoffs and those types of things. Daycare and childcare centers, where they are short staffed, so 10% less staff, they're having to look at ways to continue to operate. So that might include reducing capacity, raising their prices, or just turning people away. And so, people who can't find childcare have issues re-entering the workforce. Some of the pandemic orders, the closures have limited access, border closures, that should say, have limited access to immigrant workers. So that population is less available to work than before. And then a lot of baby boomers are retiring early. They're doing well in the stock market. They're calling it the bull market, and baby boomers are taking those funds and retiring. A lot of people are leaning into self-employment. So whenever people were laid off during the pandemic, or maybe their hours were cut, or they had to look for alternate employment, they created their own opportunities, and now some of those are just sticking with those opportunities. The consumer demand is really high at the moment, and so there's a lot of people looking for goods and services, and so a lot of people are trying to offer them themselves instead of having to go through an employer, so they can have some of that flexibility that they're looking for. Federal relief dollars have made some people less eager to return to the more strenuous or lower paid jobs. And then, of course, a lot of the lower paid workers are changing industries entirely. They're seeing opportunities where other people have vacated, or they're starting to hold out for the right fit. Since there are so many openings, a lot of times when people were offered a job, they would take it regardless, even if it wasn't necessarily the right fit from an hours perspective or location perspective. Now people are really holding out for those perfect opportunities. And then a lot of people are just increasing their focus on mental health and family connections. So maybe moving closer to family or leaving jobs that were stressful and detrimental to their mental health, when otherwise they really wouldn't have been planning to leave before the pandemic. And then there are still a lot of people who are dealing with COVID infections or caring for folks with COVID or some of the longer term effects of COVID. And then the fear of COVID is always one. So, you hear a lot of people ask, where is the workforce? And so these are just some different places that they are, and part of why we have such an issue. So how are businesses handling this? As we've talked about, there's a lot of focus on recruiting strategies, a lot of unique ways to recruit people, focusing on making sure it's easy for them to apply, maybe using mobile apps and those types of things. But a lot of businesses are also, just from a functional and operational standpoint, reducing their hours or reducing the days that they're open, reducing their services, which we're seeing a lot in the hotel industry specifically. They're not offering hot breakfast anymore. Your room is only cleaned each day by request, those types of things. Of course, increasing pay to keep the current workforce, and then focus on labor-saving technology, that should say, digital stations to take orders. You'll see this in a lot of places now. When you go in, instead of going to the counter to order, you'll actually enter it in a kiosk, and then your food will be sent out to you that way. Self-serve checkout stations are, of course, they already existed, but they're increasing in popularity. And then using tech tools to increase productivity in general. So in a lot of hospitals, they're trying to test different tools that will allow nurses to serve more patients, because of course we all know there's a nursing shortage. And then focusing on retention of your existing staff so you don't have to recruit, looking at unique benefits, things that might not cost a lot to implement, but really go far with your population. So pet insurance, flexibility when it comes to the hours that they work or the locations that they work, that type of thing. So again, very high level, but just wanted to give you kind of a piece of all of the literature that's that's being circulated out there about where our missing workers are. All right, and now if Tyler is ready, I think we can switch over to the legal and regulatory changes. And then if anyone has questions, of course, as always, put them in the chat and we can address them at the end.
Hi, everyone. Good to be back. Hope everybody had a happy Halloween. I just threw up a different kind of picture this week, just a picture of my family and our Halloween costumes. But let's get right into a big EEOC update that happened last week when we were making these slides. I know a couple times it says yesterday, but this was actually back on the 25th. But first, we need to discuss what happened back in December of last year. So this was the first big EEOC update into the religious exemptions for the COVID vaccine, and what else the EEOC decided just for COVID's purposes. Back then, they decided that the administration of a vaccine by an employer is not a medical exemption for the purposes of the ADA, and that pre-screening questions are subject to ADA standards for your disability-related inquiries. I know we've gone over all of this in the past, but there has been some changes, so it's important to kind of refresh on some of this. Asking an employee pre-vaccination screening questions implicates Title II, so you need to be careful there. And sincerely held religious practices and beliefs are protected in enforcement from the COVID vaccinations. They did also severely broaden the definition of what qualifies for a religious exemption, and we'll cover that here in just a second. But actually, we can go ahead and slide right into that, because I think that's important to cover right now if we want to go to that next slide. So I'm going to read the full definition of religion just so you get that picture again. These protections apply whether the religious beliefs or practices in question are common or non-traditional, and regardless of whether they are recognized by any organized religion. So they don't have, your belief could be, I don't believe in vaccinations, and technically speaking, under the extremely broad religious definition, if that is a closely held religious belief, then in 2020, that would have been okay. The test is whether the beliefs are, in the individual's own scheme of things, religious. So it needs to be what you would define subjectively as a closely held religion. Belief in God or gods is not necessary. Non-theistic beliefs can be religious for purposes of the Title VII exemption, and non-discrimination provisions of the statute also protect employees who do not possess religious beliefs or engage in religion. So I want to read that again. Non-discrimination provisions of the statute also protect employees who do not possess religious beliefs or engage in religion. So the definition of religion is that it no longer has to even be a religious belief. It just needs to be sincerely held. But last week we got more updates, and this is pretty big. So this is a major update on the religious exemptions for vaccines. So let's go on to that next slide if we can. The EEOC determined 5 things. First, that an employee must notify his or her employer of their exemption request due to that closely held religious belief. And they haven't identified a form of that notification. We're assuming it's probably written. But be prepared there. Your employee must notify you of that request to have an exemption for the vaccinations. 2, an employer should still assume that religious exemption requests are valid. So the EEOC has said there should be a general assumption there that the religious exemption requests are valid. You should only be objecting if you have an objective basis for doing so. For questioning the sincerity of that belief, and you can make a limited factual inquiry simply to allow the employer to seek additional information, not to outright say that exemption request is not valid, but just to kind of make that initial inquiry into whether the request is valid. And this was kind of the change here. The EEOC kind of doubled back on that. You can have a religious exemption without a religion by saying that the Title VII protection extends to non-traditional religious beliefs, but it does not accommodate social, political, or economic views or personal preferences. Now, you could probably stretch it and say that those social, political, economic views or personal preferences are sincerely, closely held religious beliefs, and you could maybe get away from it, especially considering that they would like employers to assume that those religious exemption requests are valid. But it does give employers a little bit more of an ability to kind of poke and prod into the validity or sincerity of the religious beliefs that their employees may hold. But be careful when you do that. Again, assume that they are valid. If only really do the poking and prodding, for lack of a better term, if you're really needing to, or if you really know for a fact that employee is just kind of trying to get out of that vaccine. So 3, employers should consider alternative employment arrangements for those who are seeking reasonable accommodations, so long as the arrangements do not impose undue hardship. And again, they're the same things we've really been talking about for the last year and a half. That is going to be, maybe reassign them to a position where they're not seeing as many people, or telework where they can work from home if able. Deciding whether that undue hardship will exist for the employer is going to be particular for each situation. There isn't going to be a set rule where this will automatically be an undue hardship, especially if an employer is trying to make everything an undue hardship. Just keep that in mind, that telework and reassignment are key, and they will generally get you out of that situation pretty easily. The EEOC has stated that employers will need to demonstrate how much cost or disruption the employee's proposed accommodation will involve. If you have an employee who is requesting something unreasonable for their religious exemption, you don't have to follow that. You can look at what your costs will be, how the employee's work will suffer, or maybe their coworkers, or lots of different factors to determine whether that religious exemption is necessary, or whether that accommodation is the appropriate accommodation, rather. You can look at, here's just a few examples. You can look at, does that employee normally work in a group setting? Are they going to be in close contact with other people and being unvaccinated? Do they work with people who are medically vulnerable, where vaccination is really going to be a requirement? Or are they working inside or outdoors? If they're outdoors, maybe you can give them a little bit more leeway. Those are just a few things to consider. And finally, employers who grant religious accommodations may reconsider their prior decision. So if you've granted it in the past, you do not have to grant it now, or if you've denied it in the past, you can grant it now. You are allowed to discontinue previously granted accommodations if that accommodation is no longer being utilized for a religious purpose. Again, we would caution you here. You don't want to fight from your employee and with the broad definition of religion, and as long as it's a sincerely held belief, then they're probably going to get that religious exemption if it were taken a step further, say legally. But you do have the right, if circumstances have changed to you as an employer, if it makes it more difficult for you based on how your last year has gone, how you kind of changed your structure to fit better with telework or with COVID. You are allowed to also push back there and say that circumstances have changed. We are no longer going to grant your accommodation. I do apologize. I'm at home today. I've got a dog sitting here next to me, so there may be a bark or two. Just to ignore it. The EOC, what they're doing here is, okay, that's enough. The EOC, what they're doing here is they're really trying to undo that prior guidance that you saw back in December. It was really overbroad, and they didn't realize what they'd have to have in terms of, for lack of a better word, again, forcing these vaccinations on the public. And now the only way that they can really do that is to go back, kind of undo that prior guidance and say, well, we know we said this, but that guidance doesn't really work with what we want to do now, so now you can change it. They're trying to really double back, which is unfortunate, but that's part of big government at work. So we'll move on to that next slide. And this is not Kentucky related again, but it does kind of set the lay of the land for the future here. The Supreme Court issued a ruling with 3 dissenters last week. I believe it was on Friday. It was a ruling, on the mask mandates and vaccine mandates. 3 conservative judges dissented. It was brought by healthcare workers who were being forced to have these vaccines, even if they put up a religious exemption, to which the state of Maine said that they will not allow any religious exemptions. Many thought that especially Amy Coney Barrett, who has been pretty open about her religious beliefs, would find it hard to kind of separate the judicial side of things and her personal beliefs. She was apparently able to do so, siding with the dissent and issuing a separate concurring opinion, along with, I believe, Kavanaugh, but I could be mistaken there. So that was struck down by the Supreme Court, or was not struck down by the Supreme Court, which makes it so states are now allowed to create these vaccine mandates for those in the healthcare industry. It's not clear whether that can be expanded past healthcare, but they are allowed to mandate vaccines for those within the healthcare industry and not allow any religious exemptions for those people. So that's a big step from what we've seen and before with how we just covered the EOC allowing religious exemptions. If you're in healthcare or you can maybe see it move into law enforcement or just first responders in general, you may not be allowed to put up a religious exemption according to this recent Supreme Court ruling. So again, there was a big dissent, but it's something to think about. And that little note down there at the bottom, so far there is not a mandated booster, but actually just this morning, which is why it's actually not in the slides, just this morning, a hospital in New Jersey declared that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is insufficient for their employees. We are not sure on the legality of this. Literally, this came an hour ago. Haven't had much of a chance to look into it. But a hospital in New Jersey has declared that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is insufficient. They've also declared that all employees must get a booster outside of that vaccine before Christmas or they will be terminated. We don't necessarily see that being a legal issue at the moment. We're not sure whether it's going to be challenged. We would assume that there are some healthcare workers who would like to challenge that. But with how the other vaccine and mask mandates have been faring in front of the court system, we really don't see much success there, especially if the Supreme Court is going to uphold a vaccine without any religious exemptions. It's unclear as to how they would really rule here, especially with conservative justices ruling on the side of liberal justices. So it's really interesting to think about. Courts have essentially sided with the vaccines and the mask mandates every step of the way. There's very few where they've really been struck down, and that's you're looking more local governments there than the bigger national side. And on the national side, every time it's coming in favor of vaccines and mandates. So these healthcare workers, you may have you definitely have to get a vaccine. You may end up not having the ability to seek that Johnson & Johnson vaccine, and there are no religious exemptions for you should that particular state choose to implement that on your behalf. We do see numbers in Kentucky going down a little bit. We've been looking at the map that they show. On that map of Kentucky, we've been seeing every county red for quite some time. It is nice to look now. Numbers are slightly down. We see a lot of orange and even some yellow counties coming in. So the numbers are heading towards the right direction. So that's a good thing. And last but not least, of course, is where is that emergency temporary standard that we've been covering the last few weeks? We don't know. They have had upwards of 75 meetings on this in the Regulatory Affairs Office, and we don't have a clear directive of when it's going to be coming. All we keep hearing is that it should be here by now. It's not, so just keep waiting. And as was pointed out before, with the prior ETS last year, that did take quite a bit of time. So maybe they're just trying to really stamp out any particular issues, foresee any legal battles, and move forward with hopefully a better product that more people can get behind. We will send you an update as soon as we know something about the ETS. We check every day. It just hasn't came through yet. So once we get the particular wordings on that, then we can definitely provide better direction. But in the meantime, the best advice to take is the advice we've been giving, and that is prepare yourself. Definitely get prepared as an employer for what you're going to have to do, especially if you have more than those 100 employees. Go ahead and prepare your employees, prepare yourself, and check back at our prior guidance as to how you can really look forward and not be left in the dust when this thing gets sent out. So that's all I have today.
We did have one question that asked about, you're talking about religious exemptions and related to healthcare workers. Is there any insight into health exemptions for healthcare workers, and if those are still going to stay in place?
Now, again, I do want to reiterate that was just I believe it was the state of Maine. So Kentucky does not, that they haven't put that in as well. That was the state of Maine, and the challenge to the Supreme Court by those healthcare workers. And if the Supreme Court of the United States has said that religious exemptions will not stand, I don't necessarily see health exemptions standing either, absent a very, very serious, nearly guaranteed reaction. Courts tend to, in the judiciary, they tend to look at religious exemptions as almost the peak. That is a very strong exemption due to our religious freedoms. And if they are not allowing religious exemptions, that really paves the way for them to not allow any kind of exemption, period, under an emergency standard for those healthcare workers. So if you are in healthcare, be prepared. I don't see Kentucky doing what Maine did, with Kentucky being a more conservative state. you are less likely to see a conservative state not leave a religious exemption for anyone, especially healthcare workers who have really pushed hard for us the last year and a half. So you don't necessarily have as much to worry about in Kentucky, but in some of those maybe more left states where they're going to be pushing this, I could see a health exemption not standing.
Okay, great. And then we had a couple more questions just trickle in. Has there been any more guidance about mandated vaccination for federal contractors and subcontractors?
No, that will come when the ETS comes. As far as I know, that is the guidance we gave 3-4 weeks ago is still the best guidance there. And that is if you will have any new contracts, old contracts, it doesn't apply. Any new contracts, federal contracts, will have a provision in it which will mandate those vaccines.
Okay. And then one more, are employers still mandating that employees should wear masks in Kentucky?
If they aren't, they should, especially with the ETS coming out. I don't know. Actually, masks haven't been covered as much as vaccines lately, so I'm not sure whether that is mandated. It wouldn't surprise me, but they definitely should if they aren't.
All right, so as you all can see, the Sherman HRCI codes are up on the screen. And if you've got any more questions, get them in really quick before we wrap up. This might be the shortest one we've ever done. That's
yeah, definitely a short one.
Yes, just trying to give you all just the information you need, and we'll have a much more in-depth one whenever we actually have the guidance from OSHA. So in general, you can probably expect that we'll have another one of these within the next 2 to 3 weeks. But of course, as Tyler was saying, and as you all probably know, as soon as the OSHA guidance is released, we'll probably have an emergency session to go over that once we've had a chance to review. So, so thank you all so much for, this is, so we had one question. Do you feel employees that normally see clients in person but are now only seeing clients digitally, do you feel working from home is the best option? So that's almost more an opinion question.
Yeah, that's definitely more of an opinion question. We probably have to have more details to really answer it accurately. Every job is going to be slightly different. It just depends on whether you're coming into the office at all or whether you're going to be around people. But again, everybody's going to be treated the same way once this ETS comes out, unless you're under 100 employees, and they're still probably going to find a way to make some of that mandated. So just tune in here in a couple of weeks. Hopefully we get it soon. I know there's a lot of people up in the air, a lot of things up in the air. So we'd really like to see what the government's going to direct and then be able to advise you accurately when that happens.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. I'll open it up here. Anyone's welcome to say hello, but otherwise hop off and we'll see you next time.
Hey, Tyler, Allison.
Mm-hmm.
Just one thing that I noted about the OSHA ETS that I read a couple of articles last week, that there were numerous lobbying groups lobbying the administration to hold off until after the first of the year on that. And their reasoning was they were concerned that it would continue their labor shortage and issues with getting product overseas and so forth. So I thought that was interesting. I don't know if that'll have any effect or not, but I read a few articles. I was going to try to post one of those in the chat, but I couldn't find the link to the ones that I had read.
No, I've heard the same thing. A lot of people were worried about, especially with Christmas season and people being able to get out and purchase, which we desperately need. How that would really affect the staffing shortages, and maybe it is a better idea to leave it till the end of the year.
That's interesting.
Tyler, quick question. I couldn't type it quick enough on the chat, but I'm just curious what you've seen around if employers are testing, if they are paying for the testing or not. I've seen several different articles around it, and different opinions around whether or not something will happen. Something came out from Bloomberg just this past week, I mean, like 2 days ago, that said that they could be leaning towards workers paying for it rather than the employers. So I didn't know if you'd seen anything else.
I've seen that as well. The reasoning I've seen behind it is that it really does encourage, when the money's coming out of your pocket, you're more likely to go ahead and get that vaccine.
Exactly.
So that's one I could actually see being challenged by the courts if you're going to end up imposing a cost on someone that is a monetary cost, and I can see a challenge there. That employers are in the best position to pay that, and they should have to do that. There could be a factor whether that employee is providing your insurance or not. I've seen that discussed as well. If you have insurance paid by the employer, then maybe that needs to be negotiated to be included as part of your insurance benefits. But until we really see more, there's a lot of speculation and not a lot of guarantees. So.
Great, thanks.
Oh, great. Thank you, Chip, for sharing that link. Anyone who's interested, we've got the link Chip mentioned in the chat.
Yes, thanks, Chip.
No problem. There are several articles out there. That was one I just found that I had read.
Like how to, and for us to save Christmas, we have to delay our emergency ETS decision. Priorities, people.
Save Christmas. All right. Well, thank you all so much.
Bye, everyone.
So we'll see you next time. Bye.